Welcome to section 10, and it's that time. It's finally time to deal with error handling in our application. And when we say error handling, we're also going to incorporate validation into this section as well, because we have not been doing that yet either. So the learning goals for this section, the first thing we'll take a look at is validation. We need to make sure the data we receive from our client is something that we would want to store in our database. Now, validation can take place at multiple different levels. You can validate against the database directly. That would be the lowest level that you can validate. You can protect the data at the database level. You can validate at the domain level. And your entities you could add validation to make sure that they're validated against. And you can also validate against the business objects level as well, or the DTO level, the things that you're sending to the server from the client. Now, we're just really using domain entities just now to receive the data from the client as well. In terms of the activity objects, that's all we really have. So we'll be working with that initially. So we're also going to take a look at handling HTTP error responses. We've got an API, and we're going to receive HTTP requests, and we're going to send back an HTTP response. And occasionally, we may need to send back HTTP error responses. We're also going to take a look at how we handle exceptions. And the goal of this is to really centralize the handling of any exceptions we get in our application and deal with them in custom middleware that we create. We're also going to take a look at using Axios interceptors as well, because on our client side, we're also going to want to centralize the error handling so we build it once and then we don't really need to think about it again. So using clean architecture comes with some additional things to think about. And if we just remind ourselves of the clean architecture model that we looked at earlier on, then this describes what we're currently working with. We've got our entities at the domain level, and then we've got our use cases, which maps to our application layer. Now, our use cases do not know and should not care about what technology we're using to present the data that it returns. So in our case, we've got an API, but we should be able to swap that API with a console application, and it would not affect the logic inside our application layer. But we also know that our API controllers are responsible for sending back HTTP error responses. So we need to think about how, if our application layer does not know about our API, it could be an API, it could be a console app. It shouldn't care. So we need to think about how we handle the logic inside our use cases, because we need to code defensively. And if we do get an error, we need to pass something out from the application layer to whatever's going to use that response. So the key rule of clean architecture is the dependency rule, and the goal of this is that dependencies are encapsulated into each ring of the architectural model, and these dependencies can only point inwards. So again, to emphasize, our application does not know, or our application layer does not know about what technology is using to present that data out to the client in the end. But what we also need to take care of is HTTP error responses. We cannot send, because our application layer does not know about our API, we cannot send HTTP error responses from our application layer. But we do have to send HTTP error responses from our API controller. So an HTTP error response, everything in red is an error. In this case, a 400 equates to a bad request. Also, validation errors get sent back as 400 bad request responses. A 401 would be unauthorized, a 403 would be forbidden, as in you've authenticated to the server, but you're not allowed to do what you're trying to do. A 404 would mean that it's a not found, and anything in the 500 range is a server error, and that encompasses many, many things. But typically, a 500 internal server error would mean there's a problem with the API, and we've returned an exception. And obviously, anything in a 200 range would be okay. So we need to think about how we're going to deal with this with relation to the clean architecture model. If our use cases do not know that we're working with an API, then what do we send to the API? Now, if we go back to what we were looking at earlier with regards to mediator, and our API controller uses mediator to send an object to a mediator handler. Now, our logic is contained inside the handler. And this is where we're going to be checking for any errors. Supposing, for example, from our API controller, we requested an activity with a GUID that does not exist in our database. Then our mediator handler is going to need to handle this logic and return the appropriate response to our controller. But this cannot be a HTTP response because it doesn't know what technology it's using to pass this object onto. So the object out then, this object, we're going to create a result object. And the result is going to be a success, which contains the objects that was being asked for, or it's going to be a failure, and that's going to contain the error information from our handler. And then it's going to be down to the controller to check the result and send an HTTP response depending on what the result is. So that's how we're going to handle this. This will require some refactoring inside our mediator handlers, because instead of returning just the objects that we're looking for, we're going to have to return a result object now, so that our API can check what's inside the result object and send the appropriate HTTP response. So that's what we're aiming towards in this section. Don't worry if it's not 100% clear conceptually, because as we build this, you'll become familiar with what we're doing, why we're doing in this case. So let's take a look at the before and after of what we're hoping to achieve in this section. And if we take a look at the before, well, we don't actually have a before really, because we're not doing any error handling. If I attempt to make a request to an activity that doesn't exist, well, this is the result. We just get a loading spinner. In other words, no error handling at all. But after we've added error handling into our application, then if we try and repeat the same error that we looked at before and just try and put a fake GUID into our activity, then we get taken to a not found page. Also, we're going to create some test error component or a test error component so that whatever we do in any type of error that we get information depending on what type of error it is. Then it'll take them to different kinds of toasts or components or whatever it is. And all of this functionality we're going to set up in this section coming up.